So we talked on Thursday, no, Tuesday, sorry. It's been a year of this. Time is meaningless now. We talked on Tuesday about the advantages of sexual reproduction. We talked about the twofold cost of sex, the fact that sexuals can't reproduce as fast as asexuals can, but that's more than compensated for by the fact that sexual reproduction generates variability. It enables um, negative mutations to be purged because, if you're carrying a mutation that has a negative effect, you at least have a chance that some of your offspring won't be carrying that. We talked about the tendency to accumulate negative mutations as it's called Mueller's ratchet. Remember, a ratchet is a toothy wheel that turns in only one direction, like a socket wrench. In fact, it's been proposed that the selective reason why sex evolved in the first place, back in the days of whatever primordial slime there was, is it's a means of DNA repair. Your DNA gets broken, you get a copy of DNA from somebody else and patch it in. Um, that's basically sexual reproduction right there. That leads us into more general questions. And there's an entire field that we can't do more than touch on in the time we've got, looking at how evolution affects life histories, not just the phenotypes, not just traits like feather length or flower color or whatever it is, but looking at how natural selection shapes the entire history of an organism from fertilization to maturity all the way to death. Richard Dawkins, probably best known for writing very accessible, if somewhat peppery, popular level books about evolutionary biology, came up with a concept called a Darwinian demon. Darwinian demons don't really exist. A Darwinian demon would be an organism that was born sexually mature, crank out huge numbers of very high quality offspring, and live forever. Fortunately, no such organism exists, and in fact, no such organism can exist because there's only a finite amount of energy and resources available on Earth. Of course, every organism is competing with others. Ultimately, life on Earth is almost entirely fueled by the sun, and there's only so much solar energy available per square meter. And that forces organisms to make trade-offs, to mature, maybe reproduce rapidly, but die young, or reproduce slowly, but live longer, or, mature rapidly, but die young, things like that. And this is just like anything else. If you're designing a car, maybe the ideal car would be, a Hummer that went 200 miles an hour and got 200 miles to the gallon. But ultimately, you have to make trade-offs between a car that's big versus small, a car that's efficient versus inefficient, and a car that's fast versus a car that's not. Ultimately, having to do with the laws of physics. Ultimately, having to do with the fact that you burn more energy pushing a heavy car than a light car, and so on. So you get trade-offs like this in absolutely everything. And life history theory examines how it is that organisms allocate finite resources among growth, reproduction, longevity, defense, and all of the other things that they do. given that no organism has infinite resources, what sort of budget do species evolve towards? What's the best plan for using the resources that you've got? What allocation of resources will allow you to leave the most copies of yourself and thus be favored by natural selection? The single biggest of these constraints is sometimes called the fast-slow continuum. There are organisms that develop fast, don't live very long, and have very high reproductive rates. And on the other hand, there's organisms that develop more slowly, live very long, and have low reproductive rates. If you've taken ecology, you might have heard about this distinction between R-selected and K-selected species. This more or less corresponds to that distinction. R-selected species are things like weeds, reproduce an enormous amount. That's often correlated with maturing fast but not living very long. K-selected species have much lower reproductive rates, and that's usually correlated with living much longer and developing more slowly. Humans are definitely towards the slow end of the continuum, whereas something like an oyster would be over on the fast end of the continuum because oysters can crank out something on the order of 10 million eggs every breeding season. You can get organisms in the middle, but there are some combinations that you don't seem to get, like fast development, high reproductive rates, and a long lifespan. That's getting close to this Darwinian demon, which can't exist in the physical world. And that's an example of something we call an evolutionary constraint, which is basically a limit on what is possible to evolve. There are some constraints that are what we call physical constraints because they are, imposed by the fundamental laws of physics. You're never going to get an organism that evolves to move faster than light. Because at least in our current understanding of physics, we don't think anything can go faster than light. You're not going to get an organism that is shaped like a sail and that swims at 100 miles an hour because the physics of fluid flow pretty much dictate that you can't get away with that because a organism shaped like a sheet or a sail is going to have very high drag, and so on. And this is another one of those constraints, that there are some combinations, some conceivable types of life history that you just can't evolve. So here's a couple of examples of the extremes. Nothobrancus furzeri is a little African freshwater fish called the turquoise killifish. Its lifespan in the wild is 1 to 5 months, and it can complete its life cycle from egg to sexual maturity in 14 days. Not a great deal of time. This is actually becoming popular and attracting some interest as a model organism to study the aging process. So if Dr. Ferris ever gets tired of Caenorhabditis elegans, the roundworm that she works with, I don't know, maybe she'll switch over to turquoise killifish. On the opposite side of the continuum, that's a Greenland shark. Greenland shark. Sorry. A couple of years ago, they caught some Greenland sharks. These are commercially fished in some areas, and carbon dated their eye lenses and made the astonishing discovery that Greenland sharks can live for over 400 years, in which time they can take over 150 years to reach sexual maturity. and you thought you were never going to get through puberty. It could be a lot worse. You could be a Greenland shark. I say may live because we don't know a lot about Greenland sharks living in very deep water in the polar regions. They're not very easy to observe, but they seem to be pretty much on the farthest end of that fast slow continuum. The difference is explicable through selection. Turquoise killifish live in temporary pools in Zimbabwe and I think Botswana, one of the surrounding African countries. I forget which. But that part of Africa, like many parts of the tropics, has a rainy season and a dry season. And there are pools that fill up with water during the rainy season and then dry out during the dry season. So they may be dry for, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 months out of the year. The eggs of the killifish can resist drying. So the eggs just go into suspended animation in the mud and wait for the rains to come back. But when the rains do come back, the adults only have a few months to complete their life cycle. So under those circumstances, the fish that sexually mature the fastest have the best chance of making babies. The fish that mature sexually more slowly have a much greater chance of getting caught when the pond dries out before they've had a chance to mate and lay their eggs. So selection there has presumably acted to shorten that life cycle. I don't know if it's as much as it can be, but I think that's the shortest life cycle known in the vertebrates. Greenland sharks, on the other hand, dang it. Okay, Greenland sharks' environment is probably a lot more stable. Certainly, it doesn't dry up every year because it's the Arctic Ocean. There's a lot less energy available, a lot less food, lower population densities. But in that stability, that probably favors organisms with very slow metabolism, but with a long lifespan. Although here it turns out we really don't know that much about how Greenland sharks live. So I don't know if we really know the details on why they've been selected for such an incredibly long life. But it seems to be correlated with a low energy but very stable environment that's very cold, and metabolisms tend to run slow. All right, I'm going to absolutely horrify you with the next few slides. This is an Australian mammal. It is, in fact, a marsupial. You might remember when we were talking about Darwin's visit to Australia, I pointed out that Darwin was amazed to see the ways in which Australian mammals mimicked placental mammals from elsewhere in the world. So you might remember there's an Australian ant-eating marsupial called the numbat. There is an Australian gliding marsupials, the sugar gliders. There are marsupial carnivores like the now extinct Tasmanian wolf that does look like it could be a wolfish animal, but in fact it's a marsupial. It reproduces by giving birth to underdeveloped embryos and keeping them in pouches for a long time. This is yet another one. This is a so-called marsupial mouse, the genus Antechinus. And Antechinus and a couple of relatives are the only marsupials that are semelparous. What the heck does that mean? Semelparous organisms reproduce once in their lives and die. The most famous semelparous organism that you probably know is salmon, right? They lay their eggs in a stream. The larval fish drift downstream to the ocean, mature there for 3, 5 years, and then swim back upstream, sometimes to the exact stream where they were born, reproduce exactly once, and then die. That's a famous example of a semelparous life cycle. Most fish and almost all mammals are iteroparous. That's ITERO parous, meaning they can reproduce more than once. Itero should remind you of words like reiterate, meaning to repeat something. Okay. But Antechinus and a couple of related genera are the only semelparous mammals, and they reproduce exactly once in their lifespan, and the males promptly die. The females survive to give birth, but not too much longer after the babies are mature. And the reason is that in Australia, that's also a continent that in some parts is subject to the same kind of wet, dry alternation of seasons. You've got a dry season and then the monsoons come. And there is typically one huge seasonal surge in the insect population, which is what Antechinus eats. So food may be pretty scarce for most of the year, but there's one great big boom in insect populations. And Antechinus females bear their offspring right at this time of the surge. And they bear them so well synchronized that in one species, in any given population, 70% of the females will give birth on the same day. Now, the reason that matters is Antechinus tends to have very large litters. The largest marsupial litters, in fact, they'll average about 8, in some cases as many as 14. And if you're a marsupial, you give birth to a not very developed baby. It's still essentially an embryo, and the babies crawl into your pouch and stay there until they can live on their own. And the babies will just latch on to nipples and feed on milk for all this time, which means that mommy Antechinus has to crank out enormous amounts of milk. That's a very significant energy expenditure. The upshot of all of this is that Antechinus has been selected to give birth right at the time of this insect surge. That means, because the gestation period is fixed, that Antechinus has been selected to mate in a very narrow time window. You have to conceive babies at exactly the right time, or they might be born too soon or too late, and you'll miss that surge in the food supply. This gives Antechinus one of the most horrifying mating systems that you'll ever see. Because males, they live exactly 11 and a half months. In their lives, they build up enormous reserves of sperm. When the mating season kicks in, the males stop eating. The sex hormone levels go through the absolute roof. Stress hormone levels go through the roof. Their immune systems shut down. They start breaking down their own muscles and organs for a source of energy, and mate continuously for 3 weeks. One mating session can last up to 14 hours. The males will mate with as many females as they possibly can. And this goes on, and at the end of 3 weeks, the males are completely used up. Since they've shut their immune systems down, they've all got gangrene, their fur is falling out. This picture right here shows a dead male Antechinus, and they will still try to mate even as they're dying. I mean, those songs about, long lovemaking sessions that last all night sound very good, but when a species actually tries it, it starts turning very death metal. Pretty horrifying. But an Australian scientist, Diana Fisher, who studied Antechinus closely, shows that there's variation in this, and it's correlated with the ecology. There's 10 Antechinus species in Australia, and some of them live up in the north. Since this is Australia, that's the tropics. Australians talk about the deep north, where we might talk about the deep south. There's others that live farther south and tend to live in grasslands. And in the species living up in the north, that's closer to the tropics, there's less seasonal variation. The food supply tends to be available more year round. And in those species, this kind of lifestyle is not nearly as extreme. In fact, males sometimes survive the mating season. Down in the grasslands, the food supply varies much more sharply. You've got a much bigger and narrower surge in the insect population. That's where you find the species of Antechinus where the males mate for 3 weeks and then fall to pieces and die. So yeah, selection actually seems to be a very good explanation for why these organisms have the life cycle that they do. And as my wife has just reminded me, it's pretty horrifying. And maybe I should have suggested you go in another room for this part.
Oh no, you and your little Lovecraftian horrors are just fine.
Okay. But it makes sense in the context of natural selection. She's also found that in Antechinus species where the males always die, males also have larger testes relative to body size. This graph shows on the y-axis, that's the log of body mass for specimens of several different species of Antechinus. On the y-axis, you've got the log of width of the scrotum. And in the species where males always die, those are shown by filled in circles. And testes there tend to be significantly larger than males that don't always die, which are shown in open circles. We'll see this come back, but testicular size is one way you can estimate the amount of energy that a male puts forth into reproduction. The bigger the testes, the more sperm you can produce. The Antechinus males that live in the grasslands only get one shot. You've got to mate as many times as possible in 3 weeks. And at the end of that time, you're dead. So, you can't lose this one opportunity because there will not be another one. So that means that selection favors Antechinus males that put the maximum possible energy as possible into their one chance at reproducing. And it's taking me some effort not to launch into a rap from Hamilton. But yeah, these Antechinus males cannot afford to throw away their shot. Sorry. I don't know. You could also launch into Eminem right here. Feet fail me not because I only got one shot. What does he say in Lose Yourself?
You must not miss your chance to find this opportunity once in a lifetime.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
not going to keep doing this.
All right.
We're canceling him. You got to go back.
We are?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So, yeah. So what selection has done here is shaped life history. There is a particular strategy that works best in the environment that some of these Antechinus species experience. And in that environment, individuals that follow that strategy and allocate their limited resources in that way are going to leave more offspring than organisms that don't. So as horrifying it is from a human-centered point of view, it's the strategy that works for Antechinus. You can look at this in other species as well, and one way to do it is looking for species that naturally vary This is an example of a dimorphic species, which just means that you have two or more different phenotypes. This is a common cricket along the South Atlantic and Gulf Coast of the US. This is Gryllus firmus. This individual, you can see it's got short wings. The wings don't cover the abdomen completely. There are other crickets in this species that are long-winged. The difference is genetic. It's due to the inheritance of multiple genes. There's not one single gene for short versus long wings, but it is genetic. That's a long-winged cricket up there at the top and a short-winged at the bottom. The long-winged, I guess it's not super clear, but I hope you can see that the wings go a lot farther back than the short wing does. Long-winged crickets have powerful flight muscles. They can disperse. If conditions in their local environment are poor, they can move somewhere else. They have allocated more of their metabolic energy to building those muscles and using them. The trade-off is that their gonads develop more slowly. Short-winged crickets have bigger gonads. They don't fly. They don't grow larger wings. Those take energy to grow. So they invest more energy in reproduction, but they can't disperse if conditions go badly. Now, I don't know if this has been tested, but this sounds like it would be a good candidate for frequency-dependent selection. Remember, we talked about that, where instead of different phenotypes having fixed fitnesses, selection may favor whichever phenotype is most rare. So I would guess that if you have a population that's dominated by short-winged crickets, they can reproduce more, but they'll exhaust the food supply faster, which will then favor long-winged crickets, which can escape and find new sources of food. So I would guess that it would be a good potential example for frequency-dependent selection. I don't know if anybody has tested that yet. I should look. I'm not a cricketologist, but it might be worth looking into. Things get really weird when you look at mating strategies. We're going to talk about sexual selection at great length coming up next week. But when we talk about dimorphic species, we have short and long-winged crickets, and each one allocates resources in a different way that is sometimes favored and sometimes not. The same thing turns out to be true when you look at phenotypes of males in the same species, because there's actually quite a lot of species that have two different types of male. You're looking here at cuttlefish, relatives of squid. On the left, that's a large female cuttlefish. On the right, that is a smaller male cuttlefish. Okay, is everybody there? Okay, you all there? I'm not sure what happened there. I just got momentarily kicked off. All right, I take it everybody can hear me. Sorry, checking the chat. Okay, that is confirmed. I'm not sure what happened there, but let's get to there. Let's get back. All right, so I was talking about cuttlefish. That's a large female on the left and a smaller male on the right. Cuttlefish are one of a number of species in which males actually come in two types. Large males, sometimes called the parental phenotype and sometimes called garters, pair up with females or sometimes with groups of females and defend them against intruders and then mate with them exclusively, or at least try to. So they'll pair up with a female, mate with her, and try to keep the other males away. In the same species, you can get small males called sneaker males that are usually physically quite a bit smaller, sometimes looking deceptive. They might look like females, for example. And these are the ones that will slip past the garter males and try to sneak mating with the females. In some cases, they might get away with this because they look like females. In other cases, they might get away with this because they're just very small and fast. So that is a sneaker male cuttlefish who's managed to get past the guard of a large garter cuttlefish and is sneaking a quick moment of reproductive ecstasy with the female. And this turns out to be surprisingly common. That's an invasive species in the Great Lakes right now. This is the round goby. Gobies belong to a family of fish that tends to hang out on the bottom and prop itself up with its fins. Typical goby males build their own nests, attract females, court them, get them to lay their eggs in the nest, guard the nest, and protect the eggs, fanning them with their fins to make sure that oxygen keeps coming in, oxygenated water. And so males in this species, typical males, tend to invest a great deal of energy in this, in building and guarding the nests and courting the females. However, there's two types of males in this species. Up there at the top is a garter male. Down below is a sneaker male, very small, but produces lots more sperm than a typical male, because what the sneaker male will do is wait until a female is laying her eggs and slip in and fire off a cloud of sperm and fertilize that female's eggs. And then, of course, the garter male ends up taking care of those eggs and expending energy on raising them. The sneaker male can afford to be smaller because he's not going to do that. He doesn't have to build the nest. He doesn't have to fan the eggs. He just has to slip in, fire off his sperm, and beat it. Another species that does this is one you might know if anybody goes fishing. It's a bluegill. Typical males build nests on the bottom, defend them, and try to attract females to them. They've got a second type of males that when they're small, they're sneakers. They will slip in and fire off a cloud of sperm and beat it while the garter male is distracted. As those come on, Waggoner. As those sneaker males get larger, they develop into a phenotype that mimics females. And in the same way, looking like a female means that they can swim up to a mating pair of bluegills without attracting the male's attention and slip some of their own sperm in there. In this species, that difference is genetically determined, but there's other fish species that do that. And in those cases, it may be environmentally determined. It may be phenotypically plastic. And in some cases, males might switch. You get this in invertebrates as well. Isopods are a group of crustaceans. The ones you would know would be roly-polies. They are one of the few crustacean groups that's actually evolved permanent land-dwelling forms. I know you've seen roly-polies, pillbugs, or sowbugs, or whatever you call them. This is a marine species that lives inside sponges. So this, if you ever seen SpongeBob scratching because he's itching, it's probably because he's got a case of these. And it turns out there are three types of males. On the right, that's an alpha, and alpha males stake out breeding territories inside a sponge and defend them, try to keep their females in the breeding territories and chase off rival males. Beta males in the middle sneak past alphas because they look like they're females. Gamma males on the far left swim fast enough they can dodge alphas, and they're basically fast attack sperm bombers. They'll swim into the sponge, dodge past the larger and slower alphas, fire off a cloud of sperm in the general direction of a handy female, and then get the hell out. So 3 different strategies right there. I don't know off the bat whether this is genetically determined or whether it's phenotypically plastic. That would actually be really interesting to find out. One more case of this that I can't resist showing you. This is the western side blotch lizard from California, Uda stansberriana. And the males of this species come in 3 different color forms. On the left, that's an orange-throated male. In the middle is a blue-throated male. And on the right, that's a yellow-throated male. I believe that in this case, the difference is in fact genetic. And what makes this really convenient to study is that the color is correlated with mating strategy. Orange-throated females aggressively defend whole harems of females. They'll attract a whole bunch of females and mate with all of them and defend their females against all comers, any other lizards. The problem is that an orange male with a bunch of females cannot defend all of them at once. Yellow-throated males are the sneakers, because a yellow-throated male will sneak in and copulate with a female in an orange-throated male's harem when the orange-throated male isn't looking, because the orange-throated male cannot defend all of his females all the time, everywhere. Blue-throated males are at least temporarily monogamous. Instead of guarding a group of females, they'll guard a single one. They can defend against yellow-throated males, right? A yellow-throated male can sneak a copulation in the harem of an orange-throated male because the orange-throated male can't be everywhere. A blue-throated male has only one female to defend, and so the yellow can't sneak a copulation with the female of a blue-throated male. The problem is the blue-throated male is vulnerable to the orange-throated male because the orange-throated males are bigger and can take their territory and take their females. So what evolution has evolved here is basically a game of rock, paper, scissors, where each strategy can beat a second strategy and is defeated by a third strategy. And in fact, this seems to be a case of frequency-dependent selection, because whenever any one of these strategies is most common, a different strategy has an advantage. When there's lots of orange-throated males, the yellows have lots of opportunities to copulate. When there's lots of yellow-throated males, the blues are favored because the dominant yellows can't beat them. And then when the blues are favored, the orange can move in. So the frequencies of all 3 phenotypes seem to go in a cycle that I believe takes about 10 years. So yes, natural selection has invented rock, paper, scissors, where there's no strategy that is permanently dominant. And whenever one strategy becomes more common, the strategy that can beat it is favored by selection, which is freaking cool, if you ask me. Okay, sorry. Okay, somebody's got a mic on. Okay, I didn't know if you meant to have your mic on or not. We can even look at this in species that don't have separate males and females in the first place, because quite a lot of species will produce the gametes of both sexes over the course of a lifetime. Uh, Species that do that are known as hermaphrodites, at least in animals. Quite a lot of flowering plants do this as well, but I've never heard of flowering plants called hermaphrodites.
Perfect.
Usually just called, yeah, perfect flowers are flowers that have both male and female sex organs. I had to point out to somebody that real potatoes, Solanum tuberosum, have perfect flowers. So real potatoes, the flowers have both male and female sex organs. So the whole flub about gendering Mr. Potato Head a couple of weeks ago was biologically completely silly, because real potatoes are both male and female at the same time, and nobody seems to bother about that. Anyway, right. Um, uh, uh, Never mind. Anyway, when we're talking about animals, we still tend to use the term hermaphrodite. And in simultaneous hermaphrodites, individuals produce both eggs and sperm at the same time. In the animal kingdom, this usually doesn't mean they can self fertilize. Very often, there's some kind of physical guard that means that organisms may be simultaneously hermaphroditic, but they don't normally fertilize each other's eggs. Land snails and earthworms are examples of simultaneous hermaphrodites, but they still have to copulate with another individual. I'm particularly fond of banana slugs, which is a big yellow slug native to California coastal regions, where, yeah, they have to get head to tail and simultaneously fertilize each other's eggs by each one inserts their penis in the other one's receptacle, except for the unfortunate instances where the penis gets stuck and they have to bite it off, and the unfortunate victim can then only function as a female. Biology's weird, man. I love it. Sequential hermaphrodites will start as one sex and then switch. If you start as a male and switch to becoming female, it is protandry. If you start as a female and switch to male, it's protogyny. Proto is Greek for first, and andro and gyne are the Greek roots for male and female, or man and woman. So protandry means man first, protogyny, female first. All these strategies work because in a particular environment, they'll maximize reproductive output. So just a few examples. This is a Caribbean fish called a butter hamlet. Sorry, sweetie, that's what it's called. It's called the butter hamlet, Hypoplectris unicolor. They're simultaneous hermaphrodites, but they do need to copulate with other fish, right? They can't self-fertilize. So two of these fish will pair up and they will repeatedly switch between producing eggs and producing sperm every few minutes over the course of a mating ritual that can take several days. So, yeah. Great example of protandry are clownfish. I know you've all seen Finding Nemo. And I really wish Pixar had called me in to consult, because clownfish will live very close to sea anemones. They don't get stung, whereas other fish will if they get close. So clownfish are very well protected. And clownfish will live in a group of one mature male, one mature female, and then immature males. The immature males are not related to the mature male and the mature female. The mature male and female The female lays eggs, the mature male fertilizes them, and the offspring, once they're hatched, will disperse to other groups. If the mature female is removed, the mature male switches to female, and the largest immature male becomes sexually mature, becomes the next mature male. What this means is that if Finding Nemo had been done accurately, I think it would be a much better movie, because Marlin would be trying to cope with the difficulties of raising Nemo and then, of course, finding him when he gets lost, while at the same time negotiating his own transition to Marlena. And I think this would have made for a much more emotionally rich movie, definitely one addressing, modern day social concerns. I really think it would have been a stronger movie if Marlin had been trying to negotiate his own transitioning while at the same time trying to fulfill the roles of a devoted father. But, Pixar, I wish Pixar would call. My rates are quite reasonable, but they've never asked me to consult on any of their flicks. Okay, protogyny here. California fish called sheep's head wrasses, shown here in a kelp forest. They all start life as female. And you can tell because the females are pink all over, and that's a female on the left. After about 4 to 9 years, they'll switch over to male. They'll develop these black bands on the head and the tail after between 4 and 9 years, depending on how much food is available. Why do these work? I don't know that we can find a single law that governs all of them, but simultaneous hermaphroditism seems to be favored in cases where individuals can't find each other easily. One case would be when they're very sparse. Another instance would be like earthworms, when searching is difficult. Think about it. Yeah, come on, Wagoner. Think about it. Imagine you're an earthworm. There might be lots of members of your species in your local garden plot or wherever you're living, but how are you going to find them when you've got minimal sense organs because you're burrowing in the soil? It must be a matter of luck to some extent to find another earthworm. We see this in deep sea fish, for example. There's not a great deal of food in the deep ocean. Most deep sea environments are dependent on dead organisms and fecal pellets raining down from the upper levels of the ocean where there's light and therefore photosynthesis. So there's not a great deal of available food. Populations are relatively small in the deep sea. With not a lot of energy, many deep sea fish are pretty lethargic most of the time. They don't have the energy reserves to go on a major search. And because it's darker than the inside of a dead cow down in the deep sea, it's not that easy to just go looking. Finding a mate can be very difficult when there's virtually no light. And so what seems to be favored in environments like this in many cases is simultaneous hermaphroditism. This is the deep sea tripod fish, Bathypteroius grallator, with these very elongated fins that it can use to just kind of rest on the bottom. And we know that this fish is a simultaneous hermaphrodite simply because, it doesn't have many chances to find another individual of its species. And if it's male and the other fish that it finds also happens to be a male, then it's kind of out of luck. The comedian Woody Allen used to joke that being bisexual doubled your chances for getting a date on Saturday, which is kind of fatuous when you're talking about people, but it does actually seem to work when you're talking about tripod fish. In other deep sea species, the sexes are separate, but the males are parasitic. This is a deep sea anglerfish. This is another type of fish that you might remember from Finding Nemo. Um, there's a number of species of deep sea anglerfish. This is not the one that attacked Marlin and Dory, but it does belong to that group. And this is another thing I wish they'd shown. The females of these species can be fairly large. The males consist of nothing more than very large sense organs, a tail, and a testicle. And when they're born, they use whatever sense organs they've got, either extremely large eyes or sometimes humongous nostrils, swim around in search of a female. And if they find one, they will permanently latch on to the female. Okay, Melanocetus johnsoni is probably, that may well be what they based the deep sea anglerfish in Finding Nemo on. Although I think they made that anglerfish just a little bit more horrifying than any species that I know. In some anglerfish species, the males can still freely swim, but they just stay very close to a female all their lives. There you've got a female with an associated male. The males will swim freely, but they'll temporarily bite onto females and hang on. There are other species where the male permanently latches onto the female. In the ghostly sea devil right here, the male's tissues eventually completely fuse with the female's tissues. His circulatory system fuses with hers. Her heart pumps blood for both of them. He starts getting all of his nutrition from her.
This is my ex.
And yeah, my wife just said this reminded her of one of her exes. Possibly some of you female students have had male consorts that tended to behave like this. Yeah, this is not entirely unprecedented, but it's the way that it's creepy if we're talking about humans, but it works in this particular species where the odds of a male ever finding a female are so low that if he ever does, it is adaptive for him never to leave under any circumstance whatsoever. Really?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, my wife just made me imagine the male anglerfish singing, "Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down." And I have just now rickrolled my class. I'm in great form. Okay, right. Oddly enough, you can find this in other species. This is the green spoonworm, Bonellia viridis, native to places like the Mediterranean Sea, if memory serves. That's a female. Spoonworms belong to a smallish phylum. Actually, now they've placed in with the segmented worms. They're not considered a separate phylum. They used to be in the phylum Echiura. The females of Bonellia viridis can actually get pretty large. The body can get up to, I want to say, about 10 centimeters, and that proboscis that's attached to the body can extend for over a meter. These reproduce and they have free swimming larvae. The larvae will drift around in the water for a while, and then a larva that settles to the bottom will develop into a female. A larva that touches the proboscis of a female develops into a dwarf male. Over there, you've got a female on the left, and that's a male on the right. The male is about 1 millimeter long. Okay, the main body can be up to 8 centimeters, but the proboscis can extend to 2 meters, not just 1. These males originally attach to the proboscis, but they go on to crawl into the female body cavity, and they take up residence in a specialized organ called the androecium. Andro is male, and that Esium means a house. So the boy's house, the man cave, is where the males live, and one female may have dozens of millimeter long males living inside her own kidneys, doing nothing but fertilizing her eggs and presumably watching football and ordering a lot of pizza. Just a guess here. But again, that's a strategy that sounds outlandish if you put it in human terms, but it works for Bonellia viridis. And there's actually several other invertebrates that have the strategy of having dwarf males. Oh, I didn't include a slide. I really should. When Darwin was had come back from the Beagle and was developing his ideas, someone suggested that it was all very well and good to come up with theories about natural selection, but what you really needed to do is test them by very close study of one particular living group of organisms. Your theory might sound great, but it might be contradicted when you actually try to apply it to a real group. So Darwin ended up writing 4 volumes on barnacles. Barnacles are crustaceans, but they're highly modified. They'll swim around as larvae, but they will permanently stick to a surface. And once they've stuck, they can't possibly move. In some barnacle species, there are separate males and females. And the problem is that if you're permanently glued to a surface, you can't go around looking for mates. So in some species, you have separate sexes, and the males and females are of equal size, but the males have penises that are several times their body length. Because if you're here and the nearest female is a couple of centimeters away, you can't go over and introduce yourself to the female. You have to make like the Bell telephone system used to advertise back in the 70s, reach out and touch someone. So the male will reach out with his freakishly long penis to fertilize the female's eggs. In other species, though, you have the dwarf male phenomenon. The males are extremely small, and they may consist of pretty much nothing but a penis and a testis, and they will permanently attach onto females. Darwin found this in barnacle species in the genus Scalpellum that he had collected from South America when the Beagle was going around the southern tip of South America and coming up the coast of Chile. And he noted that you could find every gradation from males and females of equal size to males smaller than females to dwarf males living permanently stuck on females, and even a species that had managed to dispense with males entirely and was hermaphroditic. And he pointed out that, you know, you might wonder how something like hermaphroditism could evolve from ancestors in which males and females were of equal size. And he pointed out that you could find intermediates if you looked at the full range of living species. This actually gets me onto a rant that I think I'm going to save for a little bit later, but it's the beginning of an answer to the question, how can you evolve complicated things? Sometimes you can see evidence that it's possible because you'll find intermediate stages in the spectrum of living things that show you how it's possible to have an in-between state. Anyway, that whole dwarf male thing is probably a selective response to being a species where, you know, once you mature, you're permanently stuck to one place and you can't ever leave. In some cases, it may be adaptive. If you're a male, to settle on a female and become a dwarf male, um, and do nothing but fertilize a female's eggs. Darwin actually wrote somewhere, he dissected one of these, which is hard to do because they're less than a millimeter in size, and pointed out that it just consisted of a sac with a testis and, as he put it, a wonderfully elongated probosciform penis, which is kind of a funny thing when I imagine Darwin writing phrases like that. But it's there. Okay, that kind of got off on a tangent. Why do we have sequential hermaphroditism? It's because by definition, it costs more to make an egg than a sperm because eggs are bigger. Um, it's not necessarily got to do with chromosomes or anything like that. It's just that in most species, the gametes are of unequal sizes, except in things like some seaweeds where the gametes are the same. But typically, you've got a big gamete and a small gamete, and the name for the big gamete is the egg. And it costs more energy to produce an egg than to produce a sperm because eggs are bigger, and eggs often carry high energy stores of nutrients, yolk. So if you're small, you don't have the energy to produce lots of eggs. So it makes more sense to invest your energy in producing sperm. So if you're small, instead of saving up your energy to produce only a couple of eggs, it makes more sense to try to produce many more sperm and try to get females to accept your sperm. You'll produce more offspring that way than if you start out by making eggs. On the other hand, once you get larger, once you're big and you have more resources in your body, now it becomes adaptive to produce eggs. So if you look at how the size of an individual correlates with reproductive success, with males, it's pretty much a straight line. Big males produce more sperm than small males, but the line is straight. With females, you have to be above a certain size in order to have enough resources to make eggs. And once you cross that size threshold, suddenly you have a lot more reproductive success because you're making lots of eggs now. And so, according to Matt Gieselin at the California Academy of Sciences, that predicts that there ought to be a size where those curves cross, where it becomes more adaptive to be a female than to be a male. And that should be the point at which sequential hermaphrodites will switch. Protogyny, on the other hand, plays by slightly different rules because this is a species where large males are favored because the males are territorial. This is yet another one where males defend, quote, harems of females. We probably should come up with a different term for that, but I'm not entirely sure what, whether there's a consensus yet. Lady Lex. Okay, maybe so. But there's a lot of species where a male will try to maintain exclusive access to a whole group of females. And in this species, the larger the male, the larger the group he can defend. Small males are at a disadvantage because a small male will get sand kicked in his face and get his lunch money taken away by the bigger males. If the small male tries to move in on a female, the larger males will drag him into the bathroom and give him a swirly, or whatever the equivalent is if you're a fish. So a small male can't defend against large males. In this case, it's more adaptive for a small fish to start out female. True, she can't produce that many eggs, but if she starts out as a male, she's not going to mate at all. And it's adaptive in that case for her to switch to becoming a male once she has gained some size, gained some physical strength, and gained some experience. So all of these strategies, simultaneous hermaphroditism, sequential hermaphroditism, either protandry or protogyny, all of those can work depending on the environment that you're in. And they all make sense if you look at them as the product of natural selection. By the power vested to me, I'm stopping the recording there.